Bom dia a todos. Welcome everyone. É uma grande honra estarmos aqui mais uma vez apresentando essa reunião geral do Departamento de Psiquiatria da Faculdade de Medicina da Universidade de São Paulo. Hoje será minha última reunião geral organizando como organizador. Na próxima já teremos a ilustre presença da Dani, que eu tenho certeza que vai nos abrilhantar. Infelizmente ela não pôde estar aqui, porque ela está no estágio externo. Mas eu muito feliz de estarmos aqui hoje na nossa nosso último encontro com um grande mestre de todos nós. Acredito que é uma grande inspiração para todos nós, que é o professor Cloninger. E antes de apresentar o professor Hermano e o professor Cloninger, eu gostaria só de apresentar 2 slides do nosso congresso, que eu queria convidar a todos para participarem do nosso congresso, que é o Congresso Clínica Psiquiátrica, que vai acontecer entre 5 e 7 de maio, no Centro de Convenções Rebouças. O nosso congresso de departamento vai contar com inúmeros especialistas nacionais e internacionais, e eu tenho certeza que todos vocês vão adorar estarem presentes com a gente. Bom, a gente tem que entender que a modalidade presencial está com um preço especial, tanto para os nossos residentes, tanto para os residentes de outras instituições, e também para todas as pessoas que desejam se inscrever. Então, não percam essa oportunidade, vai ser muito bom estar com todo mundo lá nesse nosso encontro. Bom, moving forward, now we have a wonderful, terrific talk with Professor Cloninger. He's going to talk about personality, health, and well-being, developing an adequate biopsychosocial theory. Professor Cloninger, he's diretor da Anthropedia Institute e professor emérito de psiquiatria da Universidade de Washington at St. Louis. O Anthropedia Institute é uma organização sem fins lucrativos dedicada ao desenvolvimento do bem-estar por meio da inovação em saúde e educação. Cloninger publicou 10 livros e mais de 600 artigos em psiquiatria, psicologia e genética. Membro da Academia Americana para o Avanço da Ciência e da Academia Nacional de Medicina dos Estados Unidos. E como debatedor, como sempre, a honra de termos aqui nosso professor de departamento, o professor Hermano Tavares, que é professor associado do Departamento de Psiquiatria da FIMUSP, coordenador dos programas ambulatorial do jogo patológico, programa ambulatorial integrado dos transtornos do impulso e o programa de psiquiatria e saúde mental comunitária do IPQ FMUSP. Seus principais campos de atuação acadêmica são saúde mental, saúde pública, dependências, transtornos do jogo, transtornos do controle do impulso, impulsividade e personalidade. E, como sempre, a grande honra de contar com os nossos chefes do departamento, o professor Orestes Forlença e o professor Elipse Constantino Miguel. Bom, well, I would like to move to English now. I'm sorry for those who does not understand us, but I'm sure the great majority will keep up with your presentation, Professor Cloninger. So, the focus is for our residents, our academic community, and for everyone here who knows you. We are very glad and excited to have your present here with us, okay? So we have an hour of presentation, then 30 minutes of discussion. As the last week we did, we will answer all questions right following Cloninger's presentation prior to our discussion and everyone to have time to answer all questions, okay? So anyone who have some questions, please type in under the YouTube channel who is going presenting this talk. So Professor Cloninger, please feel free to present your slides and start your presentation.
Okay. I'll just say a few words first that You may know that I trained and spent most of my career at Washington University, which had always emphasized the medical model and defining specific diseases with clear-cut criteria. And I approached understanding these by doing biological research on genetics and psychobiology. But as I did this, I realized that there was a whole dimension to our treatment of patients that was being neglected. And that is to understand not only how to treat diseases as discrete syndromes, but to understand the path of promoting health and well-being more generally. And so there's a great deficiency now throughout the world in our neglect of how to promote health. And so the challenge for us as people who want to take biology seriously is also how we integrate this with psychology and the social aspects so that we can provide our patients a pathway to health. So let me begin.
Rodolfo, maybe you can help him.
Well, that's right now. Just click in the icon of PowerPoint. In the bottom of your screen, in the bottom on the right, move right, like right under your, I think your face, your image. Yeah, under, below. Yeah, left. Yeah, below this icon.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So this is a picture of me with my grandson exploring one of our national parks in the United States. And of course, you see the topic is to try to develop an adequate biopsychosocial theory that allows us to help our patients. The outline is I'm going to explain why this is such an important task by considering some of the current health, social, and ecological crises that we're facing. But then I'll go through definitions and measures of personality, health, and well-being, and consider what are some of the requirements in order to be able to make this evidence-based and testable. And then I'll go through describing how I was able to develop such a theory based on the evolution of learning in the human lineage. And I'll go through both some of my research on the comparative phylogeny and the development of brain and cognitive systems, and then describe some recent work in just the last few years in which we've identified essentially all the genes for human personality and how they're organized. And then I'll talk about how that can be translated into methods for treatment. Now, the challenge we face now is very striking, particularly for the residents in this group, because as you know, millennials are dying 40% younger than their parents in the United States. And this is true in most developing countries. The health of people born in the US in 1981 or later is declining even faster than that of their parents. We have more chronic physical disorders such as hypertension, cholesterol, diabetes, so on. We have much more mental and behavioral disorders, including major depression, anxiety, the full range, suicide, drug abuse. And people are generally feeling more distressed, lonely, and distrustful and powerless, so that they don't feel a connection to the planet, and this makes them feel ill at ease. The people who are born from 81 to 96 have a 40% higher mortality than the prior generation. And the current generation born after 1997 is even worse off. But we don't have specific estimates of just how much worse. But everything that we measure about them is worse, in fact, than the earlier generation. These changes are reflected in physical well-being, mental well-being, and social well-being of individuals across the board, because you really can't escape the effects of what's happening, because individual well-being depends on the collective well-being of communities, country, and the planet as a whole. So we have to keep this in mind, and that's why we can't just have a molecular model of health and well-being. We have to have a model that spans from the molecular and the biological up to the family and the social and the planetary level. Just a quick review of some of this. This is data from 1921 to 2011 that shows that regardless of age, we have many people with multiple chronic diseases. And this is a problem that is a real crisis for healthcare in general. And the causes of these are not simply specific to individual diseases, but involve many lifestyle factors like smoking, diet, physical inactivity, drinking, the exposure that we have to many toxic agents in our environment and the water supply, and so forth. So we have to realize that there are factors about the way we're living that go beyond just specific molecular causes of specific diseases. So how can we go about promoting our health and our well-being? In order to promote and maintain the health of yourself and others, it's useful to understand several terms, such as personality, health, and well-being. We need to understand these very broadly in order to have an adequate theory of how to help our patients. And to motivate our patients to take good care of themselves, we need to have more than an intellectual understanding of risk factors that link behavior to diseases. What I'm really saying there is that it's not enough to just educate people about what the risk factors are for their problems. We actually have to help them to understand what the path is to developing health and well-being. And this requires them to understand, to be more self-aware. And that means they have to understand their own personality, and they have to understand how personality and lifestyle influence their opportunities for health in order to regulate their goals and their behaviors. But in addition, beyond that, we've discovered that when you become more self-aware, you actually activate processes in your body that automatically protect you against the expression of diseases. That is, we can, by becoming more aware, change the expression of our genes, as well as discipline our lifestyle habits. And this combination of changing habits to bring them in accord with what we value for goals actually then creates a state of health in which we're much more resilient. And I'll explain this as we go on. So the idea is to not just have people come to doctors to be treated for a specific disease. We also have to help them take charge of their own life in order to be their own hero, to organize their care. We need to assure access to resources that can serve us in order for that to be possible. But we really basically need to recognize that each person is responsible for their own health and happiness, and help to activate their understanding so that they will actually do that. Now, this picture will help those who find my English difficult, because it's a fairly clear cut, but it's probably a more complex picture of the relationship between disease and well-being than you're used to. Here we have, on this vertical axis, increasing well-being. And here we have a group of people who are in a particular state. I'm labeling it here as an outlook of separation. That means that the people are feeling fearful. They have a lot of negative emotions, and they have a lot of self-doubt and possibly shame. In order to move from a state like this that will have a lot of physical, mental, and social problems, to get to a state where they're much more integrated and unified view of themselves in relation to other people and the world, and to achieve more physical, mental, and social well-being and spiritual well-being, they actually have to move from this state to this state, but there's no direct path. We have to somehow activate their becoming aware and taking charge of a creative life project. Because, for example, if this is an alcoholic or a drug addict, and you ask him what makes him happy, he may say drinking alcohol or having cocaine. But we know that's really what's destroying their life. So how do we get them to understand that they can give up things that now are making them feel a little better, but are actually killing them, in order to achieve a state where they have a better set of goals in life and habits, in order to achieve a state of real health? That's our challenge. So the problem is that to activate that, they have to grow in awareness. And over the years, I've been able to develop, based on mental status examination and follow-up of people and studies of their personality, that we should distinguish 4 major levels of awareness. I'll just go through each of these, which we can describe in terms of their personality profile and in terms of their distinguishing psychological characteristics. And for the philosophical among you, I'll also give you a comparison to a very powerful allegory described over 2,000 years ago by Plato, of the allegory of the cave. People who are very unaware are actually learning only by behavioral conditioning. We'll see that our personality is basically the way we learn. And these people who are learning only by conditioning are described as very unreliable and highly emotionally reactive. They're like prisoners in a cave, trapped by their irrational appetites and desires, seeing only shadows and illusions. And when we describe them psychologically, we see that they're emotionally reactive, immature, that they're ruled by fear, habits and traditions. They're very unhealthy physically, mentally, and socially and spiritually. And the next level is one of being egocentric. That is, we have an ability to set goals for ourselves, but we tend to set goals that only gratify ourselves. This can be done by people who are mainly very materialistic, rather selfish. They can be very organized in achieving what they want for themselves. But these are people who are purposeful, but they're materialistic and self-serving. And as a result of that, because we really are social beings, they're very dissatisfied and unhappy with their life because they age very rapidly. These are the people in Plato's allegory that are described as the image makers, who use technology to cast illusions and propaganda. They're looking out only for themselves, and they try to maximize their own benefits. There's another level, and we might say too that unfortunately many of our leaders in government and many social institutions are operating at this level, which makes for a very unhappy and unhealthy society. The next level is one of being allocentric, thinking of others like a good parent. These people are quite creative, reliable, they're mindful, some have some self-transcendent experiences, and so they have a vision of a future for themselves and other people that allows them to be often quite healthy, much healthier than the first 2 levels of awareness. But they still initially are relying mainly on their physical senses and their analytical intellect, which leads to uncertain assumptions about values. So they're beyond the materialistic level, and they have glimpses of the sunlight at the opening of Plato's cave. And they're seeking to reach a source of wisdom, but they're not there yet. In order to reach that level, we have to become more contemplative so that we can directly perceive what's truly valuable for ourselves and others. So we then supplement our analytical intelligence with a kind of creative intelligence that allows us to integrate a clear vision of the future that's healthy not only for us and other people, but will bring about more prosperity and peace for everyone in a more egalitarian fashion. These are the true lovers of wisdom who are out of the cave and illuminated by the sunlight in Plato's metaphor. So they're highly self-transcendent. They have what Freud described as oceanic feelings of an outlook of unity. And what happens is when you reach this level, you activate molecular processes that promote longevity, prosocial behaviors, and virtuous lives. So I know there's a lot of information here, but I wanted you to get at least the glimpse that there are multiple levels of awareness. We can measure it in terms of personality, and you can see it when you do a mental status examination or take a history. Now let's back up a little bit and let me go through some basic definitions so that we can enrich our understanding of what I've just said to you. Personality is not just a set of fixed traits. Personality is really the way we learn and adapt to the challenges in our life. And it turns out that human beings don't have one system of learning and memory. We actually have three systems of learning and memory in addition to general intelligence. These systems allow us to adapt to changing environments, goals, and values by habit learning, which allows us to condition and discipline our impulsive emotional reactions. A second system that's rhymed in the brain for intentionality, which involves goal setting and self-control, which is effortful and more or less logical. And then there's a third system for creative self-awareness, which is spontaneous, intuitive, free, and allows us to imagine and evaluate both our goals and values and theories in order to create cohesion and integration of the mind and the body with a narrative that integrates our life story to bring concordance between our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors. So some people have said that what makes us uniquely human is our imagination. And they're talking about our capacity for self-awareness, which goes beyond just intentional goal setting, which is very effortful. Now, these three systems are all present in each of us. So as we mature, what we're doing is learning to integrate them more or less well so that we can flexibly and effectively adapt to the intelligible world. So that means we can see more than what's in front of us because we can use our imagination and capacity for theory and science to create a model of what's going on in the invisible, behind the tangible that's right in front of us. Put another way then, personality is the self plus all the internal and external forces that push and pull in us. And all of us have a pull toward being coherent and happy and satisfied, not just to seek pleasure, which tends to be transient and not gratifying in the long term. So I've defined personality as the dynamic organization within the individual of the biopsychosocial and spiritual systems by which a person both shapes and adapts uniquely to an ever-changing internal and external environment. So that means that this is a very dynamic process rather than a set of fixed traits. And the old argument about nature versus nurture is really inadequate because we're always learning our personality is our learning, and that involves both our biological predisposition and our capacity to create things that we haven't seen but we can imagine and value. So personality is dynamic. It's always changing. It's a biopsychosocial system that integrates the body with all of its impulses and the thoughts, that is the analytical mind with its intentions, and the soul, which is the creative mind, in which life is a narrative or a story that we ourselves are writing with our imagination and then deliberately implementing by cultivating mind-body cohesion. But when I say with our imagination, I'm not talking about Facebook's metaverse. I'm talking about our getting in touch with what we can intuit as a deeper level of reality that we can have an awareness of without our physical senses. So there is a deeper reality that leads to a sense of what's good for us. And it's not arbitrary in order to maximize the profits for a company. It's also universally organized in a way so that we can understand one another. We're not just amoeba that we can put in any shape that we want or insert devices or computers into us to augment us, as some people would have us do. We have a natural evolutionary capacity for further growth than what we're at now in our current stage of evolution. This is something that is an intrapsychic view of the human person. That is, what are the adaptive processes that are taking in place inside of us that we try to recognize below the surface characteristics that we see empathically. And this means that each person, because we're born with different genes, we have different life experiences, we grow up in different societies with different values, we are very unique, but we can also understand one another and we can learn to live cooperatively with one another. So the model of personality, the biopsychosocial model that I've been developing over the last 35 years, is one in which I distinguish between temperament, which involves the habit learning system or the procedural learning system, and our system for for propositional learning by concepts, which I call character. And these two both then are always influencing each other, because temperament influences what we notice, and then our values influence the meaning that we give to it. So these are always influencing one another. And then from those, we're creating an identity. We're forming our identity over time as we mature. And they're also feedback interactions. So these are very complex adaptive processes. And we have to use a way of thinking that allows for that complexity. But to do that, for us to deconstruct this in a way that we can understand the formation of identity, we have to deconstruct it into some things that we can measure. And I've identified 4 systems of procedural learning or habits that I described as harm avoidance, novelty seeking, reward dependence, and persistence. And I'll describe these in a moment. And for the character traits, we can deconstruct our character into how self-directed we are, how cooperative we are, and how self-transcendent we are. And I'll describe what that means. But in other words, what I've tried to provide is something that is measurable and testable, where we can understand the underlying biology, psychology, and then how these can be integrated. So let's look first at our habit systems. There are 4 of these that we can distinguish. Harm avoidance, we can describe and distinguish between people who are in the top third, I call them high scorers, and those who are in the bottom third on each of these. Most people are around the middle, but we can describe the extreme thirds. That's about what you recognize when you know someone fairly well. People who are highly harm avoidant are fearful and shy and pessimistic. And those that are low are more optimistic, risk takers. Novelty seekers are people who need new things to keep from being bored. they tend to be very curious, impulsive, extravagant, and quick-tempered. The opposite end, you have someone who is rather reserved, rigid, conventional. Then we have a third dimension that involves how you respond to social cues, whether you're sentimental, whether you seek intimacy, whether you need warm communication, whether you seek approval from other people. These are the people you want to ask to do a favor for you. And these are the people who are very detached and independent, and they're likely to refuse to help you if you ask them, unless it's good for them. And then these three are a little bit different from the fourth temperament because these define your emotional style. But persistence also allows you to keep going even when these are being frustrated, so that you can act in a way that's determined and industrious, even when you're a little bit scared and you're not so terribly interested in the problem or the situation, and people are telling you to give up. These people who are ambitious and perfectionistic have learned to be inner-directed and to seek goals. And if they don't have that characteristic, they often don't achieve as much as they could. But they can also, for the moment, feel quite easygoing and happy. Now, these three dimensions of novelty seeking, harm avoidance, and reward dependence give rise to interactions. So that, for example, let's consider this position here, where if we'll see many people who have borderline personality disorders are explosive. That is, they're impulsive and disorderly, they're high novelty seeking, they're low in reward dependent, so they're aloof and detached, and they're high in harm avoidance. So they have a lot of conflicts. They're both anxious, and yet they need to avoid things that are conventional and familiar, to seek new things. So we see this in bulimics, we see this in bipolars, many bipolars, we certainly see it in borderline personality disorder often. The opposite of that corner is to be low in harm avoidance, so that you're optimistic and not fearful, to be trustful and warm, and to be very deliberate. These people are very reliable, and they tend to organize their life in a way that are health promoting. I could go through more of these, but we'd run out of time. I've given you some references that will allow you to get more detailed descriptions. Now, let me point out here at this point, though, that what's actually happening is that we're not actually inheriting these individual dimensions. We're actually inheriting predispositions to profiles of all three of these traits and the fourth trait of persistence. And these give rise to the specific dimensions in particular situations, because personality is really the interaction of our predisposition and our style of learning with the particular challenges and opportunities that we're in. Now, so say we have those emotional characteristics. Our task as mature individuals is to regulate those. And it turns out that our character can be described as our mental self-government. And like most governments, we have three branches: an executive branch, which I call self-directedness. And these people are resourceful and purposeful. They're self-accepting, that is, hopeful and responsible. And they're self-actualizing. That is, they are able to regulate their habits in order to achieve their goals and values. Then there's the legislative branch that I describe in terms of how cooperative you are. That is, how tolerant and helpful, how empathic and principled you are, and how compassionate and charitable you are. And finally, there's the judicial branch that I describe in terms of self-transcendence. And these give rise to being idealistic and imaginative, altruistic and contemplative, spiritual and faithful. So I used to tell the joke that all we have to do is look at our own governments in Brazil and the United States to see good models of executive function and cooperation and self-transcendence. But it's so obviously untrue now that I don't say it too often. But it gives you some idea of why the world is such a mess right now when you realize how we're being governed, both at the individual level and at the level of communities and countries. Now, the character cube, these three traits of self-directedness, cooperativeness, and self-transcendence also give rise to interactions. And let's look in this lower right-hand corner at what I've called the apathetic or the depressive character. These people are low in self-directedness, so they're blaming and insecure. They feel life is is hard. And they're low in cooperativeness, so they think people are mean. And they're low in self-transcendence, so they don't have much imagination. They think when you die, you just die. There's nothing beyond what I can see in the physical, tangible world. Not much imagination. The opposite corner are people who are high in all three of these. These are the creative characters who think that life is not hard, but actually is full of opportunities, because the challenges we face, the difficult times we face, actually are opportunities for growth. We only grow the most in our situations that are the most difficult for us. And they also are very high in cooperativeness, so they see challenges and difficulties with other people as an opportunity to try to empathize and understand the other person and get organized. And then finally, they have an imagination and an intuition about a deeper reality that gives rise to our sense of what's good and virtuous. So these people look at life as, whatever the situation, as an opportunity for growth and satisfaction to contribute to serve other people. Now, there is a third cube that involves persistence, that fourth dimension that I said has some special characteristics. And this involves our capacity to form a bridge between temperament and character in order to be resilient. That is, we can be resilient when we're self-directed, when we're high in persistence, and we're not too anxious. And so the resilient individuals are those that are high in all three of these. They're high in persistence, high in self-directedness, and low in harm avoidance. If you have the opposite configuration, you're very fragile. And it's very difficult for you to integrate your temperament and character needs. That is, to make your habits congruent with your goals and your values. And we've worked out the underlying biology of that, and I'll describe it for you in a minute so that it's more clear. But first, let's talk about what health is. And health is not just the absence of disease, as would be implied by a disease model approach to psychiatry or health in general. Health is defined by the World Health Organization as complete physical, mental, and social well-being. They argued about whether to include spiritual well-being. And because I think they confused spirituality with religion, they didn't include spirituality. But I'll show you data that shows that spirituality, rather than religion, is actually a part of health. Religion can contribute to spiritual awareness, but they're not the same thing. So mental and social and spiritual well-being turn out to be indivisible from physical health. Well-being, then, is a contented state of being healthy, happy, and satisfied. And that means we need physical vitality. We need to have mental strengths like optimism, happiness, satisfaction, and discernment. We also have to have spiritual or transpersonal, social strengths of being engaged, serving others, and seeking meaning in our life. Now, we can see that if we're high in all three of these characteristics, we have a lot of happiness. If we're low in all three, that's these little letters, low self-directedness, low cooperativeness, low self-transcendence, we have mostly negative emotions. If you're average in these, you're just average in happiness and sadness. We can look at not only the emotional well-being, but also the physical well-being in these red bars and the social well-being in the blue bars. And you'll see that if you're high in all of these characteristics, you're high in all three. Physical, mental, and social well-being go together. If you try to separate them, you're just fooling yourself. It just can't be done in the long run. As you age, your physical problems and so on are going to catch up with you very rapidly. Now, I said I would talk about how we've worked out the biology of resilience. And that is, we were able to measure the interactions between persistent self-directedness and harm avoidance by doing functional brain imaging. And basically what we discovered is that persistence is driven by three areas in the brain: the nucleus accumbens, which is the reward center, a part of the orbitofrontal cortex called Brodmann area 47 that regulates whether to stop or continue an ongoing behavior depending on reward and punishment. And then the anterior cingulate cortex, which forms a bridge between the emotional brain and the rational brain. And so we can be sensitive to what's rewarding and satisfying and regulate whether to continue or to stop a behavior by integrating our emotional needs and our rational perception of what is a smart goal and something that we value. And so, in other words, we're able to do this integration because we can link our awareness of satisfaction with what is, in fact, a long-term good. And that gives rise to characteristics like courage and resilience and so on. So what I want to emphasize too is that the happy and the healthy life is also the good life, because what it means is that we want to experience coherence, and that requires us to also find ways to interact with other people in ways that is good for them. And that requires us to use our insight and judgment, that is our rational intuition, by cultivating our character. It requires that we learn to regulate our appetites, that is by cultivating flexibility rather than extreme values in our temperament needs, so that what we do is not what we do by habit, but is consistent with our goals and values. And then also to develop resilience by turning on this plasticity that allows us to express what we know is good. So we need to integrate all three of those cubes in self-aware consciousness. And that means that we have cultivated our plasticity, we have an awareness of what's actually good for us and other people in a non-selfish way, and we're able to put that in action in a creative and flexible manner. So this is really what I call the motor of well-being that we have to activate in ourselves and in our communities. And we have empirically shown in community studies and in treatment studies that when we activate awareness of the three character traits, and we show people how they're able to regulate their habits, that they can develop more self-control, they're more caring of others, they're, in addition to being curious, we can measure virtues in action, in other words. And this involves learning to let go, to serve others, and to be creative in our functioning, which you can see as expressions of hope and love and faith. But this is the mental aspect of those virtues in action. Now, I'll have to speed up a little bit to give us time for discussion. So let me just summarize this whole slide by saying that because we're social beings, we're really never at our best physically, mentally, or socially if we're just looking out for ourselves. It's also not enough to just look for what's mutually beneficial for us and a few friends or a small community. We have to try to find ways to take care of the country, the world as a whole, because it's only then that we can get socioeconomic equity and a healthy planet that supports our health. And this is not just a matter of kind of a Pollyanna-ish or optimistic view of humanity. It turns out that we've been able to show in studies of all the states in the United States that the more equity that we have in our society, in terms of income and social conditions, the healthier the people are and the more trust they have for one another. And this can be shown at the international level as well. But then people argue about whether people are selectively picking data about particular countries. And so I think the data about all of the states in the United States is a very powerful indicator that much of what our problem is now socially in the world is the lack of trust for one another. Now, these ideas may seem a little abstract. And so I want to translate this into a very concrete metaphor that I think you'll be able to understand. And so I'm going to use another of Plato's metaphors, and that's the metaphor of the charioteer. Here we have the charioteer that you see is flying high. He has a white horse and a black horse. The charioteer represents reason, that is our intuitive insight and judgment inspired by virtue. And we can measure that by being high in all three of the character traits, which is what I call the creative character. The unruly black horse is our irrational emotional drives, or our appetites, that doesn't want to, it wants to do what it wants now, even if it's irrational and self-defeating, like the drug addict who wants more drugs in order to feel better. And this is measured by the extremes of the three temperaments. And then finally, we have the white steed who helps and works with the charioteer. This is intended to be the people who help to bring order into our communities. It can be the soldier, the diplomats. These listen to reason and help the charioteer to reach his destination with courage and perseverance. So this is essentially the task of motivating someone, how to become healthy by cultivating a creative character, by learning to regulate their habits and to discipline them so that they are flexible and resilient. Now, there are other metaphors that the appetites can be referred to as your gut, the self-interested merchants, people who seek self-gratification, and these often lead to a lot of vices if you don't moderate these impulses. The resilience part is the white horse. That's your heart. Noble soldiers. Preservation of order is their desire. And this is often described as fortitude, but it also can give rise to some vices if you don't have a complete view of unity. And then the charioteer is the head, the philosophical rulers, the lovers of wisdom, prudence and justice, and so on. So these are just metaphors that you can use sometimes in working with your patients to help them understand, depending on their educational, ideological strengths and so on. So what is the empirical evidence? We've been able to actually then deconstruct the way this works in the body at a molecular and a systems level by doing functional brain imaging, studies of phylogeny, treatment studies, and genomic analyses. The model of my studies of the evolution of human brain functions allowed me to look at different animals over time in phylogeny, look at what their behavioral capacities are and what brain structures they are. And from that, I was able to develop this model of a matrix of abilities in which the cerebral cortex of animals essentially took over the regulation of mating, sexual functions, took over physical functions, took over intentional socializing functions, and then the symbolic functions, and finally, the integration of us as a whole, something beyond our individual selves. And what I meant by that was I was able to look, for example, at the lineage that leads to humans. And I saw that the pintail tree shrew, based on genomic information, was really one of the ancestors of all primates. This goes back 2,000 million years to the Cretaceous period. And these were little nocturnal animals, very small, like about the size of a mouse, living in trees. And then we were able to come down from the trees about 65 million years ago when the meteor hit peninsula in the Cancun, Mexico. And then about 40 million years ago, when the tropical environment of the world tended to become cooler, we started having to go out during the day in order to have more warmth. And we did that to avoid predators with large social groups. And so we evolved. It became selectively advantageous for us to learn how to get along with one another and to express and understand one another's emotions. And this just shows the capacity of some macaques who learn intentionally to wash potatoes, to get the dirt off and to eat salt. They're able to learn to imitate one another and pass this on, imitative learning. And then we see some chimpanzees here who've learned to reconcile after a fight by kissing. But these kinds of social and emotional functions are a very crucial part of our capacity for cooperation. And then about a little less than 2 million years ago, we evolved beyond some of our ancestors who were able to walk upright into this Homo ergaster, that means working man. And these individuals were able to intentionally set goals, and they developed a certain kind of tool that they maintained then for over a million years as the dominant way of adapting and supporting life for over a million years. So it was only very recently that we started to develop a capacity to go beyond what working man did almost 2 million years ago. And this was the emergence of creativity here. But you see that overall intelligence capacity was increasing, but there's special abilities here for intentionality and for creativity that emerge along with intelligence. Now this is a picture of the complete skeleton of working man from 1.8 million years ago. And you see he's physically very much like the Homo sapiens. And then the Neanderthals are a little bit more robust because they're relying less on creativity and more on brute strength in order to survive. Neanderthals also lived in small bands. They did not have the capacity of Cro-Magnon man and Homo sapiens to trust people who were strangers. And as a result of that, they became very inbred, and they did quite well. They were very resourceful and purposeful hunters, as were the Homo ergaster before them. And they had a very similar tool craft to even Homo ergaster, but they lacked the capacity for getting along in large groups. It was only in Homo sapiens, with the emergence of a capacity for perception of unity, that we developed science, narrative art and language, and spirituality, as depicted in these fossils, in this painting from a while back. So the emergence of art, science, narrative art and language really was based on the emergence of this capacity for unity. But before 2018, we did not understand what the underlying genetics of this was. We knew that from twin studies that the heritability of personality was about 50%, and that family environment seemed to be quite weak. But we also had recognized that a lot of the inheritability of personality was based on gene environment interactions, and that the average effect of individual genes was actually very weak. And so we had to develop some new techniques for understanding temperament that enabled us to understand the way complex systems of genes interacted with one another to give rise to the temperament profiles, and to how they interacted with environmental events so that there were person-situation interactions. And we did that with my colleague from Argentina and Granada, Spain, Igor Svir and his team, who had developed some methods of pattern recognition that enabled us to improve our methods of genome-wide association studies. We identified 3 profiles of temperament, and we found that there were 51 sets of genes with that came together to just a second, I have to answer a door. I'll be right back. Take a second. Sorry about that interruption. We had 51 SNP sets, which are groups of genes that work together. They're associated. We identified these independent of any environmental factors or clinical factors. And we then were able to replicate them in 2 other samples of Germans and Koreans. So we were able to study this in multiple cultures where there were different environmental conditions. And we find that there were actually 736 genes that map to these sets of individual genes. And 74% of them were unique to these different profiles of being either reliable or antisocial or hypersensitive to negative emotions. And we found that these genes code for multidimensional profiles of the whole person, not individual TCI dimensions, which was a bit of a surprise to us. And we found that the genes were in 2 pathways that respond to extracellular stimuli, the RAS-GERT pathway and the phosphatidylinositol 3 kinase mTOR pathway. So and these had, the importance of that is that these have been experimentally shown to underlie behavioral conditioning or the procedural learning in animals, studies that we can't really do in humans. But we're able to identify those pathways by using these pattern recognition techniques. And we're able to account for essentially all the heritability of temperament with these genes. We did find some environmental influences, but they're weak at the level of temperament alone. Now, this is what these networks look like. These are individual groups or SNP sets. And you can see that there are connections where these different groups are shared by some subjects, the blue lines, and they're shared SNPs by the others. But I'm not going to have time to go through these, but we could distinguish these 3 different temperaments, different gene groupings. And we were able to show, this is a cartoon that shows the importance of the ERK and the phosphatidylinositol kinase pathway. And you see that these genes are involved in every part of the cell, essentially. So they're very complex processes. We did the same thing with character. And we were able to identify multiple types of character profiles and identify the SNP sets. We were able to replicate them. And these 2 had over 700 genes. And we were able to show that the genes coded for the profiles of the whole person. And they explained all the heritability. These are what these kinds of networks look like in the characters, but I've given you the references for the papers. Just, you have to trust me at this point that we do know the contents of these and a lot about their functions, but we're currently now doing a lot of detailed work on the transcription of these genes in the person so that we can understand better the interaction of these. This is what a SNP set looks like, but I'm not going to have time to explain it to you. This is a cartoon that shows the functioning of these SNP sets in the individual cells. And what we discovered essentially is that the intentional learning is regulated by the second messenger signaling system involving calcium and the phosphatidylinositol pathway. So that temperament involves the response to extracellular stimuli, and then forming intentions involves the second messenger system with calcium, which essentially enables us to transform signals about what's going to be tasty in food to what's a good goal at a more abstract level. And we've identified the specific functions that are enabled by these genes for energy metabolism, for regulation of aging, pain, inflammation, prioritizing energy output following stress, neuroprotection, and longevity. And we found that in the creative character, those are the ones who have the good, vivid imaginations and capacity for virtue, that they're learning by episodic learning. They're genes that regulate neurogenesis, longevity, resilience, neuroprotection, synaptic plasticity, and so on. So this gives you an idea of the kinds of processes that are actually going on, but you don't need to get a genome scan on your patients in order to know how to do it. You can recognize this from their personality. We know what's going on inside the person from this, but we identified that, fortunately, because of the nature of evolution, that there are three nearly separate networks of people with different combinations of temperament and character. In other words, first we studied temperament, then character, then we saw how temperament and character function together at the genetic level and at the phenotypic level. And we found that there are three networks that I described to you in that first slide. Basically, we have people who are operating only with their behavioral conditioning system. They don't have much character development, and so they basically are very impulsive and hypersensitive. Then you have another group who are able to regulate their emotions some for their own personal goals and for mutual benefits with selected people. But then there are other people who are actually trying to make the whole of society and the world to work together. And it turns out that the genes for these three networks, phenotypic networks, are nearly separate, with 64%, 67%, that is 2/3, unique to only one network. And we also found that now we were able to powerfully identify the social interactions, because the integration of these three learning systems is done in response to environmental challenges. So the importance of social situation and the maturation of the individual is to stimulate us to maximize or optimize our sense of physical well-being, mental well-being, satisfaction, and so on by integrating the three learning systems. And it turns out that the phenotypic profiles, that is the personality traits that we can recognize, are highly correlated with the underlying genotypic networks. That's why the size of these shows that these are extremely strong relationships. So you basically know what's going on at a genetic level and at an epigenetic level by just looking at the development of the person's personality. So that means that you are able to help people to learn their habits and skills by behavioral conditioning, that they can also learn by intentional executive self-control, and they can also learn by self-awareness, which allows you to operate not only with an understanding of your emotions and your goals, but also what's good for you and other people. And that turns out that when you do that, you actually activate other molecular processes that just aren't operating in other people to promote long living, happy living, meaning, and so on, and to keep you healthy as you advance in age. And basically what we found is that there are almost 1,000 genes in these three systems, because there's some overlap between the ones for temperament and character. And we compared them because in chimpanzees, Neanderthals, and modern humans, because we knew that there was a strong relationship between the genotype and the phenotype. So we can't study the personality of Neanderthals, and we can't do it very well with chimpanzees either, because they're not very good at taking self-report inventories. We can't observe them, and we know that they basically learn through behavioral conditioning with some intentionality, but at a very rudimentary level. And we found that about 40 million years ago, there's a set of genes that evolved for the emotional reactivity system. Remember those pictures that I showed you of the chimps and the macaques? Well, that system arose from these 250 genes. And then 1.8 million years ago, in working man, there was another set of 400 plus genes for intentional self-control. And then finally, about 100,000 years ago, in Africa, there was the emergence of a set of 574 genes that enabled us to have creative self-awareness. And it turns out that Neanderthals are intermediate between sapiens and chimpanzees in terms of the genes for self-control and self-awareness. The self-awareness comes from what are called long non-coding RNA genes. And these essentially regulate the expression of groups of genes so that we're able to integrate these different systems of learning in a coordinated fashion. And the Neanderthals were about halfway between the chimps and sapiens because they were living separate from sapiens. The sapiens was in Africa, the Neanderthals were in Europe, and conditions were less challenging in Europe than they were in Africa. So for our ancestors of Homo sapiens to survive, they had to learn to be flexible and resilient and to help each other. And that was less true of the Neanderthal. So the key finding then, that what distinguishes humans and makes us uniquely human is the emergence of these systems for regulating the coordination and expression of our learning systems by long non-coding RNAs. And that is something that we know is very crucial for epigenesis. That is, we can literally change the expression of our toolkit. We can regulate genes, and that enables us to transform our own personality and to turn on systems that not only keep us healthy by choices we make about our lifestyle, but just the way our physiology is operating. And that, I've got to stop in just a minute because otherwise we won't have time for discussion. But essentially, human personality is the expression of the way these three systems of learning and memory can mature and integrate to allow us to adapt in life with experiences of plasticity, virtue, and creativity. The slide I didn't show you is that the way this happened, the way we were selected for these genes, is that as we were able to live longer lives by leading more virtuous lives, we were in a position as, say, grandparents and elder statesmen to teach others what needed to be done. And so this enabled us to develop healthier cultures. And that then set the stage for our capacity for personality maturation and integration by cultivating the healthy personalities. So it's the cultivation of self-awareness, moderation, and resilience that's needed for optimal well-being for the 21st century. And self-awareness and mind-body cohesiveness of people with a creative, reliable personality is what activates the molecular mechanisms for healthy longevity, life satisfaction, and pro-social behaviors. And this is my photograph of my working with my own grandson, one of them, to help him to understand how to get along in the world. I'll stop there and open it up for questions. Shall I turn off my slides?
Yes, just stop presentation, Professor.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Clap your hands. Professor Eddy, your video is not working.
My video's off?
No. Professor Eddy, yes, that's great.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Professor Eddy, Herman would like to say something for him.
I think I'm looking forward to hear Hermano's comments.
Oh, right. Then I will start, and then you please do get along. I mean, it puts me to think so much that I'm at danger of getting confused and confusing here, but I'll try my best. Well, you said, and that's I think a really turning point on how we think of personality. That personality is not just a bunch of traits that we have agreed upon that are describing our nature, but mostly the way we learn and adapt. So know thyself and then know how you learn from experience and how you will construct, how you're going to build values and morals and concepts, and then you can know, and then you really will know how you work and how to get the best out of the world, right? So that's just great thinking. But I was curious. You said, the self-knowledge process will trigger biopsychosocial processes. And it will trigger biological processes in the brain. So I was curious how self-knowledge can trigger this within our brains.
So the first step, what we can do in about 2 months, is with mindfulness training or meditation, contemplative practices, you can actually get a person to be able to experience a deeper reality that they may have been somewhat ignoring by focusing on the tangible world. But they have to look inside themselves to see what they're feeling at this intuitive level, which is a direct experience of what it feels like when you're trying to consider the other person or your connection with the environment. And this enables you to then feel a connection to a broader reality. And then you have that, but that can happen very rapidly. But then you still have a lot of integration to do, because you have to think about, well, what does that imply for what I really should be doing? And what are my resources? And what are going to be the obstacles? And so that you begin to set some goals. And even when you do that, then you have to think, okay, well, now I can't be constantly thinking about every movement I make. So I have to also condition my own habits to be supportive of my goals, and to have them be, which are guided by my vision of the future. So that if you take a patient who's, say, an alcoholic or a drug addict or a severe anxiety disorder, and they first have to be able to get calm. They have to learn how to look inwardly. Then they have to see with a more relaxed state. They have to get in touch with, well, accepting themselves, facing the reality rather than just suppressing it, and then figure out how to set goals and discipline their habits. And so all of those are learning processes that regulate the process of intentionality, logical analysis, but you're checking it constantly against what your intuition tells you is a deeper, meaningful, more satisfying reality, and then correcting at each step when you find, no, I thought that's what I wanted, but I was just fooling myself. And so it's a process of stepwise integrative growth that never ends. And so the integrative processes, we've shown that the long non-coding RNA genes are actually regulating epigenesis, regulating methylation, and other aspects of the expression of the genes. And so when you accept yourself, then you can actually heal some scars from past traumas and frustrations. And you can activate other systems that are protective and facilitate longevity and neuroprotection and so on. You support neurogenesis rather than blocking it. But remember that this is a sensitive process. And so as well as it can be turned on, it can be turned off. So if you're in a state of fear, if you're being treated unfairly, you become resentful. If you're addicted, if you're, in other words, a lot of the conditions of modern life turn off our capacity for self-awareness. We're being turned into Neanderthals.
Okay. Guys, can I go on? And if you want, just interrupt me.
No, but I think I wanted you to see that it's a dynamic process, because you're right on target.
Yeah. And I want to talk a little bit more about resilience too, because we are living on turbulent times. The emergence of information technology is changing the world more rapidly than we can adapt, as far as I can think of. So resilience has really become the holy grail here, right? So and you put it marvelously. Like it's resilience is about being less neurotic or lower on harm avoidance, high on persistence, and high on self-directedness. So it relies on two temperament factors. So I can see maybe through psychotherapy, through meditation, through good habits and virtues, we can enhance self-directness, we can enhance character as a whole. But can we treat temperament at all? Like, and what would be the treatment? Would it be physical exercise? Would it be meditation again? Are there drugs that we can use to treat temperament?
No. There, you may begin by using medication to help a person be calm enough and to do the work that's required. And I certainly use antidepressants and mood stabilizers. I try to avoid habit-forming drugs, but I definitely do use mood stabilizers and antidepressants. And sometimes in some people, I'll even use some of the atypical neuroleptics because they can get help with tranquilization. The point, though, is to be very careful of what you call the Holy Grail, because what is actually happening there is that we're being shifted to take responsibility and all the blame for the burnout problem by focusing only on our individual resilience rather than encouraging the institutions to consider their own values and how they're turning us into profit centers for making money and not thinking about the well-being of the population as its first priority. So to have real health that's sustainable and that's health promoting and therefore really more efficient and effective and reduce burnout, it has to be spiritually meaningful to a person. They have to pursue things that they feel is in their best interest and good for the future, which is only optimized when we're considering other people, not just an elite group. So you'll see that most of our institutions are selling a package for resilience without examining the milieu that they're creating by the profit-driven, depersonalized, dehumanized medicine that is being encouraged by most systems. And so that's crucial. So we can, as physicians, use medication, but we shouldn't be reduced to psychopharmacologists alone. We also have to have a person-centered relationship to the individual. We have to understand how this is taking place in families and in communities and on the planet. And unless we start to address this larger picture, then we're in a self-defeating path. And we're not using the skills that we had 100,000 years ago. We've been turned off by fear and social inequity and consumerism.
Rodolfo.
Oh, no, we have a question from our audience. So I think
sure,
would be great to make this question. Well,
Rodolfo, just check if Hermano finished it. Hermano, then we move to the panel.
Okay, just two more questions then, and I'll try to be brief, okay? You talked about, and I'm gonna make the both questions together and we can make it one package.
I'll try to be short.
You talked about 700 to 1,000 genes regulating what we call personality, the way we learn, etc. So I was wondering, because you said 3 networks: creative and reliable, organized and reliable, unregulated, unreliable. So that's quite different from the 7 dimensions from the TCI. I was wondering all the time while I was hearing you, if you put those genes to test, I said, if you go for a factorial analysis there, would those genes fall into the 7 dimensions that you described before? Or are you thinking of a different genetic structure now for the personality organization?
Very important question. Yeah, we were surprised that the genes didn't correspond to the individual dimensions. because most people have focused at that individual dimension level. But the individual dimensions are there, and they emerge when the profiles react to particular situations. So self-directedness emerges in a particular situation. For example, when we're trying to think intellectually and culturally about how to organize systems, because it's a symbolic level, but all of the profiles that a person has genes for may be expressed in that situation. And so the individual dimension actually is from the integration of all three learning systems in that situation. So it's quite complex, and I actually show the diagrams for how we can retrieve the genes for individual dimensions from that process. But what you can't do is to assume that the genes are operating independently, or that all dimensions have a simple orthogonal structure and then extract that. Because what many personality psychologists have done is they've ignored the biology and the spiritual aspects of it, and then just assume that we should try to get simple independent dimensions. But that doesn't correspond to the biological reality, because these systems, we're dealing with complex systems, and we know that the brain has all these feedback loops. And so you get nonlinear adaptive systems when you have those kinds of feedback loops. You don't get simple orthogonal factor structures. And all the social cognitive psychologists and the biologists know this very well. It's only the personality psychologists who are holding on to using linear factor analysis. But it's really hard to get that across to them, because their authority and their expertise is in that domain. But it's in everybody's interest to really face the reality. But it's sometimes painful for people to do that.
So would it be right to say that there's a more basic structure behind the personality dimensions? And those would be the dimensions of the habit learning and other forms of learning.
The dimensions are very important. Individual dimensions are important because they help you to focus on you in a particular situation. And it's only there that you can learn, understand it. But then from that, you have the integration process, and underlying it at the genetic level actually are these clusters that are that are, refer to the whole person. And those involve profiles of all the dimensions.
Right.
And we constructed them in a way where we can recognize it enough to talk about it with clusters. But probably it would have been better if we had worked with clusters from the beginning. But then you would still have to translate that into a person situation interaction to help a person learn in a particular domain where they're having problems. Because most of us do pretty well most of the time, but we have particular situations in which we have an Achilles heel. We have a weak spot.
Let me try one last leg pulling. Maybe not, certainly because of that. I'm older nowadays, but not so old as to think of myself as a self-transcendent person. I have lots of problems with spirituality and the self-transcendence concept itself, especially because in my work, I deal a lot with psychiatric population. Self-transcendence has a very awkward behavior when I measure it over in our psychiatric population. For an example, psychotic people scores really high on self-transcendence. So self-transcendence sometimes comes out as an indicator, as an index of severe psychopathology, of suicide risk, in fact.
Yeah.
And also very violent and serial killers have scored higher on self-transcendence. And maybe not because they feel a connection with the divine, but because they think of themselves as divine themselves. And that's really disturbing.
This is the beauty of having discovered the importance of the profile, because the self-awareness network is really only expressed when all three of these are high. So you need the true expression of self-transcendence is the creative character in which all three are high. And you're not truly self-transcendent, even though you'll give reports that look a lot like a self-transcendent person, when you're also hostile and unregulated and lacking in self-confidence. And so the people the measure of schizotypy is to be low in self-directedness, low in cooperativeness, and high in self-transcendence. So that is schizotypic, but that isn't real self-transcendence. But the person thinks it is because they're not able to face the reality of their life. And so this has also given rise to a lot of doubts about spirituality, because you'll see people who are frauds and fake and con men, but that's not real spirituality.
All right. I rest my case. Let's
So
see.
you should understand that we're all expanding our capacity to expand our awareness, and that we're always on a path. It's not that you arrived and it's done.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, we'd be bored.
Yeah.
You know the Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times.
So, let's go for the audience questions.
Orestes, would you like to
bring the audience? Make the final questions, please.
Oh, okay, great. Well, there's a question here from Joaquim Edson Vieira. He asks about, are these conditions jeopardized by the way of life offered by the modern society? Or I'm just trying to jump to unrealizable conclusions?
Yes, definitely. Our society right now is a dark place. And this is true around the world, where, profit is valued over people. There's great social inequity, emphasis on consumerism. And these are all things that promote fear, competition, and doubt, resentment, or, the opposite side of it is ego. And so you have people like Elon Musk, who wants to escape the planet in a spaceship because he sees the people on Earth are not smart enough to regulate themselves intelligently. But he lives in fear. This is an outlook of separation. And this is very destructive. Likewise, people who don't want to develop their character, but who want to implant computers who will have more general intelligence. But that doesn't give you moral intelligence or spiritual intelligence or social intelligence. And so it's a misunderstanding because of this outlook of separation, the fear and the greed, that we are being led by people who sometimes mean well, but have not yet become wise.
Wonderful. Professor Orestes, Professor Uri.
So thanks a lot, Professor Cloninger, again for this wonderful conference. I have a personal question. May I?
Please.
I'm impressed how I'm impressed, and I'm seeing here that you reached a contemplative stage of self-awareness, that you develop, you managed to activate molecular mechanisms in yourself to activate a very creative, reliable personality. And seeing your picture with your grandson, I can see that all this investment has translated in a healthy longevity, life satisfaction. And with the donation of your time for us here today, I can see how invested you are in prosocial behaviors. So my question is, what are your challenges now?
No, it's always a life challenge. Just the frustration of people who aren't listening and creating more misery for people. How do I deal with that? What do we do when people we can't help people yet? And for example, there are people with severe ADHD and schizophrenia and substance abuse who are not in a state where they can begin this work. They have to do some preliminary things to get into a state where they're sober and calm enough. And some have irreversible blockages. And so there's a lot of work to be done in research at every level. And there's also personal work to understand how to be more clear in expressing myself. And there's work in keeping myself healthy, and so it never ends. None of us is ever going to be perfect, and that actually is a blessing, because it means that we have an infinite journey of discovery and possibility of growth. That the darkest moments, the times when we face the things that are most unpleasant for us and disappointing, that's when we grow the most. And to have that recognition is enough. And it's not that I have all the answers, but I've made a lot of the mistakes, so I don't have to repeat them. And I'm trying to share that.
Thanks a lot.
Sure.
But you still have time for one question, Rodolfo? It's okay, it's just a little bit over 12 o'clock. So, Professor, thank you so much for being here with us. Fantastic talk. I was really fascinated with your integrative model and your evolutionary approach. I think it's really interesting to see how we can bring genes into this theoretical model, and how can you actually bring objective data from chimpanzees and then hominids and sapiens. So it's really fantastic. My question refers to something like what's the room for change that we have within our lifespan? If you don't look at a broader evolutionary perspective, but what's expected to change, to move this activate or deactivate genes related to these clusters of behaviors from childhood and adolescence into adulthood and then late life?
Well, if someone has gone through early life with abuse and neglect, and they have a lot of resentments, it's very hard to get them to get calm enough and accepting enough to stop blaming other people and to accept themselves and decide to move forward. But that can be done to some degree, but you can't do the work for each person. But at this point, we've been able to take people who are refugees from the Middle East. We had one of the largest studies in European Union for the recovery and rehabilitation of immigrants from EU, where we treated thousands of people. And we're able to take unemployed youth who are very unmotivated and help them to improve. So it is possible to get substantial improvements in character and resilience over time. It takes longer to recondition temperament. That's the slowest of the processes. But I think that each of us, depending on how fortunate we were in our early development, have tremendous capacity and potential for change. And that this is really a path that only makes sense to start. It's never too late. And I work with patients who are in their 80s and 90s and who make progress. It's easier when you're younger, but it's never impossible because we have this capacity for neurogenesis.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Professor Kloner. I hope we can have you in Brazil soon. Let us know when you want to visit. We'll be very happy to have you here. Thank you.
Sounds good. I haven't been traveling during the pandemic except by these remote sessions. And I have to say I miss it. Okay, thank you very much. I hope that the residents were able to learn from this, but they have the papers as well.
Thank you very much. Hopefully it won't get so long for us to see each other again. And
don't have to wait another 21 years.
Yeah, possibly we could have you in Brazil as soon as this COVID goes away. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Cloninger. Thank you very much, everyone. Next week we not have our greyhound, so we see each other in 14 days. So
All right.
Take care.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.